Welcome to this short lecture presentation on deep, surface and strategic learning approaches. My name is Simon Atkinson. Today we're going to look at the context for this presentation and then explore what deep, surface and strategic approaches might be, compare these three approaches and provide some suggestions about some of the practical implications of understanding these different approaches for your teaching. And there'll then be some links to further reading if you want to go a little bit deeper. Then objective 1.2 is synthesizing the concepts of deep, surface and strategic approaches to learning, and this lecture contributes to that objective. While you're watching the lecture, it's worth, I think, considering how your own approach to learning in whatever context varies. So have a little think as you go through the lecture, as you listen to the different approaches, where you, in your learning practices as a student, would fit, see what resonates. So what do we mean by these three different approaches? We talk about surface, deep and strategic approaches to learning. Well, the reality is that students learn in different ways. Some of these things are cultural, some of them are determined by prior experience, and of course they're very often determined by the actual context, the nature of the learning, the time conditions that are being applied, the professional aspirations and so on. So there's a direct link towards internal and external motivations and the way that individuals go about learning. The concept of deep and surface learning is something that grew out of research by two particular individuals, Marton and Säljö, in 1976, but it's been a feature of work by people like John Biggs, Paul Ramsden and others, and there'll be some references at the end of the presentation. Essentially what it does is describe how students tackle their learning. So students may have a deep or surface strategy or a combination of the two, and this has implications for the way that we actually design courses and the way that we design teaching. So a surface approach to learning is one in which learners focus their attention on the details or parts of information that they deem necessary to pass assessments. They're very assessment driven. The approach will often frequently emphasize the memorization of facts, for example, in order to pass assignments, without necessarily the student making some of the connections necessary to apply that learning in different contexts. A surface learning approach is often one in which a learning task, will be treated as an obstacle to be overcome, and this can often develop an adversarial approach to study, where the student can be very self-critical, self-punishing if this particular study style is unsuccessful. And surface learners will look to try and find ways, not necessarily to cheat the syllabus, but to find ways to decode it and to understand it in such a way that if they hold tightly to the syllabus, then they won't fail. So there is a definite fear of failure. As a consequence, they're often over-reliant on teachers, and they hold the teachers responsible for giving them the facts that they require. We can contrast this with a deep approach to learning, in which learners are looking for significance in everything that's being taught. So deep learners will often actively look to connect information and thinking across topics or within the topic in question, and try and build a kind of mental lattice work that helps support further study. They're looking forward rather than just to the immediate need. They're looking forward to the longer term development of their own knowledge, so a greater degree of what we might call metacognition. Deep learners look for overall meaning. They look to process information in a particularly holistic way, and will actively look to see how new information and new experience can be integrated within prior knowledge. So they're in a very conscious and deliberate way. As a consequence, deep learners have a tendency to develop critical analysis and longer-term retention of concepts and connections, and as a consequence, certainly in Western education, as deep learning is highly valued. Now, a strategic approach combines both deep and surface approaches. Essentially, the strategic learner is actively planning and organising their learner with high grades, but sometimes other positive outcomes in mind. And because they're focused on these positive outcomes, their entire approach to study changes from both that of a surface learner and a deep learner. They're often a subtle combination depending on the nature of the learning task. So strategic learners become very effective at identifying whether in fact this particular task warrants a surface approach. Something like a rote learning, for example, which I'll mention in a second. They understand that sometimes it's necessary to take a surface approach in order to develop skills that will then be used more deeply. Strategic learners focus on desirable outcomes, much like surface learners, but they're often interested in the recognition of that learning for themselves and the adaptation and adoption of new knowledge, much as deep learners would. And as a consequence, a well-designed and well-supported course allows students to adopt a strategic approach and still achieve deep levels of learning. Now, I've mentioned rote learning, and it's interesting that rote learning is very often, certainly in Western education, seen very negatively as perhaps representing some of the worst aspects of surface approach. But in many disciplines, the memorization of facts is absolutely essential before the application of understanding or the use of concepts in different contexts is possible. So the intelligent use of rote learning may well be entirely appropriate and could be a strategy building towards deep learning. What's important is that learners who've experienced this at one level of their study can actively be coached away from that approach towards higher order thinking skills as their studies progress, providing that the teaching staff are aware that that is in their background. And because increasingly we work with students from different cultures where rote learning may have been the dominant learning form, there is an active need for us to understand how we can coach learners away. So it's worth spending a little bit of time just looking at this table, and I'd encourage you to pause this presentation now and actually just review the table and consider where you fit and where your learning experiences might fit and where your students' experiences might fit. So I hope you've had a brief opportunity to read that table. It's interesting, I think, in particular to look at the bottom line and to look at the way in which motivation is reflected in these different learning approaches. Deep learners, by and large, are motivated by an interest in the subject, but often by a broader, wider ambition to incorporate the learning that they're currently undertaking into future professional practice, but not in such an instrumental way as a surface learner, who is doing it in a very precise way, often assessment driven, but very often motivated by fear of failure. And this again can create a kind of negative feeling towards study approaches compared to a very positive one where everything that's learnt, even if it's a setback, it's learning as a result of failure, can be seen as something very positive. And that's perhaps best captured when we think about the motivation of strategic learners who, although they'll define achievement in very different ways, are often characterised by a desire, motivation for achievement that they might talk about in terms of professional advancement, in terms of personal growth, in terms of enlightenment, in a way that's less instrumental than the other two approaches on their own. So the implications for teaching are quite profound. There are certain strategies that are known to engage students in deeper or strategic levels of learning, and it's worth looking at these. The first of these would be the relevance that a subject actually has for the student. A student's much more likely to engage in a subject that's relevant, and so we may see faculty using contemporary examples, contemporary contexts linking learning to real life and to the sort of future scenarios that students may encounter in future professional or study life in order to make the syllabus relevant. Likewise, authentic assessments where students are conscious of the need to prepare for real-world scenarios are ways of promoting deep engagement. So the whole idea of making the learning relevant and telling students very clearly why it's relevant is extremely important. It's also important to ensure that the intended learning outcomes of a program, the session objectives, the assessment, the marking criteria, all promote higher order thinking. So think about the way in which the skills that the students requires, rather than the knowledge that the student themselves may feel they want to have, might be made very, very explicit within the course. This might be about having correctly phrased outcomes, learning outcomes at the appropriate level, using active verbs that relate to the kind of practice that will happen outside in professional life or in future study life, and to reinforce those higher order objectives to give the students something to aim at. Third strategy would be to look at the way in which you can encourage students to see the appropriate approach, to encourage almost a strategic approach and see the difference between something that requires a surface engagement and those that require deeper inquiry. And one way of doing that is through a process of appropriate questioning, designing activities that actually require higher order thinking skills so that students understand the difference between evaluating and applying the learning and simply reproducing content. Everyone's very busy, of course, and it's worth making the point that thinking deeply takes time. Students often will feel that they simply don't have time to engage deeply. And so we need to adopt an approach in our teaching, which is one where we have a very reasoned workload. So students should actually understand the structure of the work that they're being asked to do. When a student asks whether something is relevant, we should always have an answer. It's important that students are able to understand the justification for the workload that they're being asked to engage in. And if the workload is reasoned and explained and well structured, they're more likely to engage at a deeper level because they'll see the benefits and the value. And the final one is about learning choices. Students not having choices in their learning will often become increasingly passive. And students who are given choices, perhaps around the nature of the assessment, perhaps around the nature of the learning activities that they undertake, will grow in terms of their sense of motivational control at deeper levels of engagement. Now you can do that with well-structured, flexible but structured intended learning outcomes, but you can also do that by being fairly nimble in terms of the kind of learning opportunities that present themselves in the classroom. All of these things, making it relevant, ensuring that there are high order objectives, an appropriate questioning and dialogue with students, an explanation and a reasoned approach to the workload, and some flexibility in learning choices, is likely to lead to a less surface approach and a deeper approach to learning. Now, if you'd like to find out a little bit more about deep surface and strategic approaches, three fairly classic, you can see classic references to work by Entwistle, the Marton and Säljö that I mentioned before, and Ramsden et al.